Professor Mazzolini, thank you so very much for joining our interview series.
Thank you.
Let me start right away with the first question.
Yeah.
How should Daniel Noboa's recent electoral victory be interpreted within the broader trajectory of populism in Ecuador? Does it signify a new phase in the evolution of populist politics in the country, or a re-articulation of existing populist paradigms under a technocratic secretarian guise?
Right. Well, there has certainly been a shift towards a sort of panel populism, right? So a populism that puts much emphasis on, delivering security, on heightening on rising the security of the country and trying to put a break on the uncontrolled expansion of criminal gangs in Ecuador. So it is definitely a re-articulation of populism under a secretarian guise. Although I wouldn't say there's been much of technocracy there. I mean, if you look at his first year and a half in power, it has been characterized by sheer incompetence, indolence, lack of professionalism. So there hasn't been much technocracy there. I mean, let alone the fact that he presents himself very well. You know, he's a young chap with fluent English, been educated in the US and so on and so forth. So he's got this sort of image, but at the same time, if you actually look at the deeds and the decrees, at what he has done over the course of 18 months approximately, well, that leaves a lot to be desired. So I don't see much technocracy there. I see, of course, a strong emphasis on security, which hasn't delivered either. If you focus on the statistics, he promised to have a very tough end on crime, on criminal gangs, etc. But the rates haven't gone down. So it is still Ecuador is still a very unsafe place to be, and the population is still very much under the grip of crime, of organized crime.
Right. Do you see Noboa's re-election and hardline tactics as signaling a right-wing variant of populist institutional tensions you identified in Rafael Correa's government?
Well, certainly, when you deploy a too populist politics, and if it is prolonged for too much, then it will be hard to build a new, stable institutional framework. It is, let me put it straight, it is only to the extent that you shift the identity of your very adversaries that you somehow start to build a stable institutional framework. So you need to shift from a polarizing strategy to one capable of reintegrating your adversary into the order that you're building. So you need to make sure that they don't change the whole system the moment that you step out of power. And in that sense, yes, a parallel with Korea can be drawn there, in the sense that there have been also under Korea a number of tensions, right, between the populist rhetoric and the institution building side. But I think there are two major differences there. The first one is that, of course, Noboa has been in power for too little. He's been in power there, as I said before, only for a year and a half. So it is a very short lapse of period for, even for a populist to have the possibility of, reintegrating your adversary, of, deploying your politics. But at the same time, and that's the second point I want to make here, is that Noboa does not seem to have a project for the country. His is sheer improvisation. When he was elected president in 2023 for the first time, I don't think he has in mind that he would become president. I think he wanted to do very well in order to, launch a more serious bid at these elections. But, he found himself as a president. Yet, I mean, the Ecuadorian right has never really had a sound, solid, clear project for the country, other than capturing the state and trying to bend it to make it a more favorable, to create a more favorable environment for their businesses. So in that sense, I'm not so sure that he he's got in mind something very specific for the future. Let's see now how his project for a constituent assembly proceeds. Apparently, he wants to change the rules of the game. He wants to revert the previous constitution that was drafted by Korea back in the early 2000s, which put much emphasis on rights, on state involvement in planning and redistributing resources. So what many people think and fear is that he wants to draft a new constitution that does away with rights, with the central role for the state in planning and the redistribution of resources, and he wants to create a more favorable environment for foreign direct investment, for national enterprises. So he wants to basically make the country go back to the neoliberal era, to put it, very shortly.
Right. How does President Noboa's militarized crackdown on crime reflect elements of penal populism? And in what ways does it diverge from traditional Latin American law and order populism?
Right. Well, I think a major difference there can be devised in the involvement of the armed forces. If you recall, from the very beginning of his mandate, he declared a conflict. So he said that he was there was a war going on with the criminal gangs, and he had the armed forces to collaborate with police forces in the fight against organized crime. So I think that's something new. Although it should be said that armed forces are not sufficiently trained for patrolling the streets, so the kind of training that they have is very different. So I'm not sure they are of much use there, and statistics so far do not seem to suggest that they are much useful. And another concerning point there, which is primary, is the utter disregard for human rights and even international law. I mean, if you look at the case of the 4 boys of Las Malvinas, which is a neighborhood in Guayaquil, who were kidnapped, tortured, and then brutally killed by the armed forces. And that's only one case, right? It speaks of impunity for armed forces and police forces in the execution of presidential orders. As I was saying, there have been many other cases of abuses, of extrajudicial disappearances, people who just vanish in nothing. And in most cases, it is people that have got nothing to do with organized crime, and it is people that have that are come from the Afro-Ecuadorian community, or are darker skin. So it is a rationalized thing, and that's of course very, very worrying. And the way the government of Noboa has shielded the police and armed forces when these cases have come up, well, that's horrifying. The way he has dealt with the whole case of the 4 boys of Las Malvinas, well, that speaks for a complete disregard for the question of human rights. And having won the elections now, I think he will feel like he's got more free hands in perpetrating this kind of, and even the armed forces will feel more bolstered and more and safer in perpetrating abuses of that sort. And another thing that I wanted to highlight, which has got to do with a kind of a populism, with the way he's interpreting populism. I spoke of a violation of international law. There's been this case, the former Vice President Jorge Glass, who has been a target of lawfare by previous governments and these governments. Well, he took refuge. He was free at some point, and he took refuge at the Mexican embassy. I think it was back in December. No, it was yeah, it was last year anyway. Um, and it looked like the Mexican authorities wanted to grant him asylum. Well, what happened is that police forces stepped into the Mexican embassy and forcibly took him out. And well, treated very badly also the embassy personnel. Well, that's a sheer violation of international law. Noboa doesn't give a damn about international law. You might not like what Mexican authorities did, but you know there are certain lines that shouldn't be violated. Um, he doesn't care. So what he did was to insult international law, and through that, you know, he presented himself to the population as as a president that he doesn't hesitate to take bold and strong action, and in a way he enhanced his figure by doing so. But that's I think that was a mad step to take.
Right. Can Noboa's extensive use of emergency decrees and military deployments, especially during the election, be seen as a textbook case of authoritarian populism? What democratic vulnerabilities does this strategy expose?
Well, definitely, we're looking at an erosion of democratic standards with the emergence of authoritarian, very worrying authoritarian aspects. I mean, a continuous state of emergency, continuous trampling on the rule of law. I mean, it's something that's been common in not just in Ecuador and in Latin American politics. There is, of course, a tense relationship between populism and the rule of law. Well, that's for sure. But I think he's taking this, a step further. Um, we have witnessed a biased use of judiciary institutions. So he has bent judiciary and electoral institutions to his own favor. As I said before, he has guaranteed impunity for the actions of armed and police forces. And we've also seen an ad hoc use of state vouchers just before the elections in order to secure electoral support. So that's basically clientelar patronage politics. So all these things configure a strong erosion of democracy in Ecuador. So that's something to look at very carefully. The only check on Noboa, this, in the coming period, the upcoming period, is the assembly. He doesn't have an overwhelming majority there. He doesn't have. I mean, he will fight in order to get his decrees approved. So that's the only institution that could somehow check on his behavior. But as we've seen many times, there are ways to get around the National Assembly, either by buying off deputies. That's something that has been happening repeatedly, by coming to terms with new coalition, with new parties, or just by expeding presidential decrees. Well, that's another way that he can somehow put forward his political agenda. In any case, yes, I think that's it's a quite clear textbook example of authoritarian populism, absolutely, with the excuse of the fight on criminal gangs.
Right. Do you interpret Noboa's invocation of internal armed conflict and the framing of criminal gangs as terrorist threats as part of a broader global trend of securitizing social crises through populist narratives?
Right. Well, right-wing populism, at the end of the day, has always said as one of its main objectives that of delivering law and order, focusing on crime, and stuff like of this sort, and stuff of this sort. Whether there's crime or not, I mean, often it is only the perception. The media full perception. Of course, in Ecuador, you've got crime. It is a major problem. And it is clear the situation is out of control. I mean, the percentage of homicides of homicides is the highest in the region, and it is one of the highest in the whole globe. And Noboa has taken advantage of this by taking a step further. So by invoking an internal armed conflict, by framing criminal gangs as terrorist threats, which they are, but of course that has got to do with with the way he has grip on power. Now, analytically, social crises are social crises, and security crises are security crises. Of course, the former, so social crises, have an incidence on the latter, but it is not a mechanical thing. I mean, there was poverty in Ecuador before. There were worrying economic indicators before. So it is a particular conception of tackling, security crisis, which nevertheless have got as causes, especially in the case of Ecuador, factors that go beyond the mere social issue, right? The partial end of the armed conflict in Colombia is one of them. They chose the choice of Mexican gangs to collaborate with, what originally were small criminal gangs in Ecuador, to have them as proxy in the country. The very retrenchment of the state post-Korea, state authorities have been much less present, much less capillary in the territory following the phase of Korea, and that has permitted, the penetration of international gangs into the country and their rooting in there. So as you can see, it's a multifaceted thing that's been analyzed by experts of the field. And right-wing populism, Noboa's populism, has been ready to jump on it and to create a whole aura of, the guy tough on crime. Although, as I already highlighted, it doesn't look like his techniques, his methods, this free reign given to the armed forces, police forces, have delivered much. Of course, in tackling security crises, you also need to solve a number of social issues, right? That indirectly fuel, right, security crisis. I think you need to have a much more integral tackling, integral approach to the question.
Right. Is Noboa's security offensive more a case of a populist responsiveness to widespread public fear, or is it better seen as a calculated strategy for consolidating executive power under the guise of emergency?
Well, I think it can be seen both ways. One doesn't exclude the other. What is striking here is that, so in a sense, there is a certain sense of Noboa taking advantage of the situation, sort of going populist because he saw the opportunity ripe for consolidating his image. When he was a candidate in the previous elections, he came through as a moderate guy, right? He came through as a guy that wanted to go beyond the cleavage between Correismo and anti-Correismo. He presented as himself as a centrist person with some even left-leaning ideas. With a special care for the poor, and he wasn't the security candidate. The security candidate was Jan Topic, different person who was who bragged about having been a mercenary already in different war contexts in his life. So Noboa, of course, everybody talked of crime. I mean, that has been a recurrent theme in electoral campaigns over the last 5 years. But he didn't seem to be, that did not seem to be his strongest point, or at least the reason why people chose him over the others. But the very moment he took power, and after a fleeting, collaboration in parliament with Correismo, he took a different turn. So he took sort of a right-wing populist route with, again, this stress, this emphasis on, being very tough on crime through, a very strong deployment of armed forces across the territory, use of emergency decrees, curfews, and stuff of that sort.
Right. You have characterized populism as a transitional device. In Noboa's case, is this transition leading toward a reconfigured institutional logic, or is it entrenching a permanent state of exception?
Right, yes, I have characterized populism as a transitional device, but that's, of course, when you intend populism as a strategy and you have a project to somehow steer society towards a particular, idea that you have in mind. So you want to transform society in this or that way. So in that sense, populism should be intended as a transitional device. Not all populists do intend populism as a transitional device. I think that in the case of Noboa, it has simply been a way to cling to power and to bolster his figures. So, in a sense, yes, I do think that it is entrenching. He is entrenching a permanent state of exception. Let's see what happens next. I mean, I'm very curious to see whether he will somehow try to normalize his his power with this constituent assembly. But again, as I said before, I don't see him as having a clear idea for the country. I mean, what kind of idea does he have about industrial relations? What kind of idea does he have about agricultural policy? About same-sex marriage? There's a number of things, of topics, of issues on which I don't think he's got a clue, right? Which differs quite substantially from Correa's project. At least those guys had a project. In some instances, it could have been, misplaced, or their way to put it into practice has been flawed in some instances. But at least they kind of knew where they were going. This chap does not seem to have a clear idea about where he's going, other than defending his wealth and the wealth of his own class.
Right. In your work on Podemos and M5S, you stress how populism's success depends on context. Does Noboa's popularity, despite rising violence and economic decline, suggest that right-wing populism thrives better under structural crisis than left variants like Correismo?
Right. Well, I think it needs to be said that right-wing populism has the benefit of enjoying much more benevolent media coverage. I mean, in all the strong powers, tend to have a much more lenient and much more, as I say, benevolent look at what you're doing. So the pressure they create on you is it is different than the one created and the one exerted on left variants of populism. So in a sense, I think the right-wing populism can endure structural crisis, structural constraints, and even blatant flows much better than their left counterparts. Then you have got to take into account that Noboa has been there for little. So people might well think, well, this guy has been there only for a year and a half. Let's extend the credit for a little longer and see how he fares over the next 4 years. And another thing that could be said here is that despite the unhappy results of Noboa over this year and a half, the anti-Correismo as a political sentiment we could call it, is still very strong. And got some resemblances in other countries. You know, you got anti-Pétain sentiment, being very strong in Brazil. You got anti-Kirchnerismo, very strong in Argentina. These, of course, are not coherent political forces. I mean, they are heterogeneous, but they're very strong in their opposition to former left political leaders for a number of reasons that I'm not going to dive into here. But the moment this large demographic segment finds a person that builds some popularity, well, then they are going to extend a check onto this person for a period. Up to Noboa, the right wing was very fragmented. Okay, and first it was Lasso, but then of course he squandered his initial popularity very quickly. You had a number of different right-wing candidates in the former elections. Now that one emerged, and of course he's still very much. He changed his mind a bit. He wasn't too much an anti-Correista before. Of course, he was anti-Correista, but he didn't press too hard on that. And now he has become one. His main enemies. The way he polarizes the country is on one side. That's why he put it at the end of the day after these elections. On the one hand, the good forces. On the other hand, the evil forces. Whereby on the evil side, he clusters together the criminal gangs and Correa and his allies, and his candidates, and Luisa Gonzalez. So that he creates an equivalence there. And that is something that, has also been very much favored by the media, by suggesting without any evidence that Correismo, has been very close to drug trafficking, to drug lords, and sort of, those sorts of things, That's a classic populist rhetoric that is paying off. So yes, I do think that for the time being, even in the face of structural crisis, he can maintain his popularity high. But let's see what happens next.
Right. Do Noboa's coalition maneuvers, including fleeting alliances with Correistas, represent pragmatic populist adaptation, or are they symptomatic of Ecuador's deep political fragmentation?
Right. Well, I mean, populists need to make sure that they can somehow govern. Okay. I mean, remember the example of Alexis Tsipras in Greece back in 2014. He was. I mean, the circumstances obliged him to strike an alliance in parliament with a right wing party, Panel. Plus, if you, as I said before, the initial period of Noboa in power cannot be really considered as fully populist. So I think it's quite in the nature of populists when they do not have a solid backing in parliament to find, temporary alliances. Another way to go around it, but of course that's a much more risky gamble, is what Correa did back in 2007, when he didn't have a majority in parliament. Actually, he had nobody in parliament because he didn't present any candidate to parliament. Yet he won the presidency. So what he did was to call for the election of a constitutional assembly, and have that assembly to override the National Assembly. And in that way, the National Assembly was disregarded. Okay, that was a very risky gamble that could have gone otherwise. In the end, it favored his, it actually paved the way for his political career. But that's not something that all that all candidates, that all populists can easily do. Especially because then, when you organize the elections for the Constituent Assembly, well, then there you need to win an overwhelming majority. Let's see now what happens in Parliament, and whether Noboa will resort to something similar. Because if he faces problems in the National Assembly, he might well want to replicate something along the lines of Korea. I'm just speculating here. There are no rumors of that sort, but the Constituent Assembly under Korea took over, legislative, current standard legislative tasks for the period it was in power. So that could well be an option.
Right. And lastly, Professor Mazzolini, corruption scandals like Metastasis and Purga have revealed links between state actors and organized crime. How should we understand this intertwinement through the lens of populist governance and criminal co-governance?
Right. To be fair, I'm not so sure populism has got much to do here. Because if you look at the two scandals, the people who were involved, there were a number of politicians, but mostly it was state officers. People working, especially in the judiciary, who were, or in the police, who colluded with organized crime. So I'm not so sure that populism there has got something to say about the particular type of introduction. I think that's got much more to do with weak state institutions, which have been traditionally, historically, very weak, very exposed to the possibility of entertaining some sort of collusion with criminal groups, and now even more so, the criminal groups are so much more threatening. Imagine a peripheral judge that is being bribed by groups that threaten him to do away with his life and that of his family. If you don't have a very strong state that provides protection, that has got solid careers, that has got a good pedagogy for its state officers, well then it is your state is much more vulnerable, much more permeable to this kind of scandals and to this kind of events. So I'm not. Yeah, again, I wouldn't necessarily call populism here into. I wouldn't say that populism got much to do here, to be honest.
Professor Samuele Mazzolini, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.